Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 6th chapter. Jesus said, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Well, have you ever heard someone say about somebody else's actions, "Well, that's not very Christian"? That's not very Christian. Well, Jesus gives us a bunch of opportunities to be Christian in his ethics lecture here, which are extremely difficult to pull off. To love your enemy, he begins. Well, if you want to be Christian, you basically gotta go against every human instinct to hate your enemy, and you gotta change your mind and allow your heart to be changed through the love of God and share love with your enemy. Love your enemy. Oh, Jesus, making being Christian a difficult task. But it turns out that Christian values turn into Christian actions. And it turns out that if you want to know what your options are in order to act like a Christian, well, we turn to Jesus. We listen to Jesus. What does Jesus have to say about being Christian? And it turns out it may actually be a lot more difficult than we thought. Because it asks of us to give to others without expecting to get anything back. That's a huge ask from God. Expecting us to love those who have cursed us. Ooh, that's a lot to ask, God. I'd rather be able to just curse them back. But that's not acting very Christian, is it? Turns out Jesus has some very difficult expectations for us to live a Christian life. And it turns out that as this begins, it says, Jesus said, "But I say to you that listen." But I say to you. But. And this is a very big but. But. You've heard it said otherwise. You've heard these other things. Oh, you hate your enemy. You've heard it said. You've heard other things said about what to do with your enemy. But I say to you that listen. Jesus, it turns out, has got something to say if we're willing to listen. something that could change our life, something that could protect us from greater harm, something that could keep us from turning something bad into a worse situation, something that could help us rewind and back up from a dangerous situation where we've just been robbed, and now we want to go chase the person down? Whoa, Jesus says, if they take your wallet from you, don't try and be a hero right now. It's what the police say. Don't try and stop the robber. Try and save your life, your health, all that is worth living. And let the stuff be stuff. And allow it to go from before you. It's tough. It's tough. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. I tell you, this is one of the hardest passages for me to learn in my youth. Why? Because I didn't think I had enemies. I tell you, into my adulthood, my character, my personality is one that I'm a people pleaser. I want you to be happy. I want you to not be my enemy. That's like at the heart of who I am. I don't want any enemies. And so when it turns out that Jesus says there's this likelihood that you're going to have enemies, Jesus is speaking to all of us. Jesus is speaking to all of humanity, letting us know that there's some familiar things that are probably going to happen to us in our life, and it's better if we recognize these situations and plan out how are we going to respond when the situation pops up in our life. Jesus gives us several examples of how we can respond when someone takes something from you, when somebody hits you, when somebody strikes you, when they try and take everything away from you. How are you going to respond as a Christian? Because I can respond as a human all kinds of ways. But how are we going to respond as Christians? Jesus says, love your enemies. What? But they're enemies. He says, love your enemies. Jesus doesn't say, feel bad about yourself because you have enemies. Jesus doesn't say, beat yourself up because you got some enemies. No, Jesus says, actually, that having enemies isn't a bad thing. He doesn't shame us for having enemies. In fact, he seems to state that having enemies is predictable in the course of a lifetime. Though, thankfully, it is not something that lasts forever. It is something that can change with time. Something that can move from an enemy into a friendship, or possibly even vice versa. Sometimes it happens in families where the closest loved ones to us, through misunderstandings or jealousies or other feelings, can all of a sudden become the enemies surrounding us, it seems. The ones that we most hoped would support us are somehow nagging at us or somehow against what we're thinking. It's strange because when I was at my first call, this is almost 15 years ago, my first church, about the second year into the ministry, I heard a window break. I heard a smashing, crashing window. And I went to the window of the house. We lived right across the street from the church. I went out to the window of the house. It was at the parsonage at the time. I looked out and I saw someone standing on the front of our car. They just kicked out the front windshield on the pastor's car. Well, how do they know whose car that is, right? I don't know whose car that is. I know how would anyone else know whose car that is? But I thought, well, maybe it's just some prankster. But I was surprised when the police asked me, so, Pastor, do you have any enemies that you know about? I thought, what? I'm a pastor. How could I have enemies? What? Jesus is the Savior of the world. How could he have enemies? I was so naive. You know, I have my suspicions about who it was because I saw the car, but the car was someone else's. It wasn't the person's because it was the son of somebody that I had been ministering with. And perhaps the son had felt some anger at me, but I let it go. And fortunately, we had this insurance that just replaced the windshield. We already had the windshield insurance, and so I asked the police, I'm like, there's a handprint on the hood. Can we lift some fingerprints? The cop's like, you don't want to do that. So I replaced the windshield. Enemies. Enemies are formed by many types of feelings. Frustrations, jealousies, self-righteousness, religious self-righteousness especially. Now, I don't like having enemies because I don't find them as a challenge that drives me into competition with them. Some people, that's what drives their competitive nature, is having the enemies lurking over. But me, I'm always trying to humor people. I'm always trying to find a joke. I'm always trying to find some humble irony somewhere. And actually, I think it's a part of my character that is a loving aspect that I'm trying to find humor. But sometimes I say things and do things and don't realize what I've just said to somebody, and it can hurt. I was just joking, but sometimes it's the wrong time to hear a joke. And it can hurt. And suddenly, before I've known it, an enemy can become one that I was trying to make a friend. Now let me tell you about a time when I made my best friend my enemy. My best friend turned him into my enemy. Now I didn't mean for it to happen. About a month earlier, I was in 7th grade. My best friend since 4th grade, Robert. He got married in this church. Several of you have met Robert, my best friend. So you know the story ends, maybe not well, but it ends better than I'll leave you here, because he was and turned into someone that I thought was my enemy. You see, he was in 7th grade, and about a month before this incident happened, the books in my locker had been taken. Somehow, they got through the school locks on several different lockers, and my locker happened to be one of the ones that they took the books out of, and my parents had to pay like $300 for new books. And they were upset. And well, about a month later, I'm coming back up from the PE, from physical education. All of a sudden, I see somebody at my locker messing with my lock. I think, not again. Not again. So I go racing up, and I recognize it's my best friend. What's he doing? Messing with my lock, the same lock that had just been broken into weeks before. I thought, oh, here's the one. It's my best friend. I've been betrayed by my best friend. So I rush up to him, and I push him. And he breaks his front tooth on the locker. Chips the front tooth, about a quarter of his front tooth breaks off in that instant, and he turns around and goes, what? And he hits me. At which point I'm thinking, uh-oh, what did I just do? Uh-oh, I've just hurt my best friend. I've just shoved my best friend into the locker so he breaks his front tooth. What have I just done? I've just turned my best friend into my enemy because I misunderstood the situation. I misdiagnosed the enemy. I misread the situation. And so often that can happen for us that we think we know who the enemy is. We think we know. Oh, this situation confirms it for me, but we may misunderstand some details. We may mistake our best friend for our enemy. And he wasn't the one that took my books. He wasn't the one that broke into my locker. He was just there that day looking at the locks, looking at the school locks they had been the ones that broken into. He was just there at the locker. Why? Because his locker was almost right next to mine. His last name was Bowens, mine was Bartlett. Both started with B-A. Why was he at my locker? Because his was right next to it. I mistook my enemy for my best friend. And every time and he never got his tooth fixed, which is, so every time since then, when I looked at his smile, it's still there. Right there looking back at me. A broken tooth that I caused, that I gave to him. And yet, we got through that. And yet, instead of making the situation worse and worse and worse, forgiveness, what I had been learning in church my whole youth, forgiveness, please forgive me. I'm sorry, Robert, I mistook you. I thought you were the one that, no, I was just hanging out here. We mistake who the enemy is. And it can not only hurt somebody else, but it can hurt ourselves. And Jesus is trying to protect us from hurting others, and especially from hurting ourselves, because I needed that best friend. I still need that friend. And I'm glad that forgiveness has helped me keep that friend in my life. Because I could have messed it up. That could have been the end. I thank God for the lessons that Jesus teaches me. I thank God for turning the other cheek. I knew once he hit me, and it wasn't a hard hit. I knew once he hit me that I'd gone too far. I'd stoked his anger. He wasn't angry to begin with. He was like, what just happened to me? We can misdiagnose who the enemy is. So it's better to err on the side of good, Jesus is telling us. We might mistake who or what the enemy is. Why make bad situations worse? Bad actions lend themselves to a slippery slope of retribution, of consequences, of guilt, of shame, bad actions. But good, on the other hand, God tells us, is full of blessings. And when we're in the right situations at the right time, Jesus gives us some techniques to bring goodness into a situation that was otherwise a horrible situation to be in. Helping to bring good out of a horrible situation rather than turning a bad situation worse. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Whew. Well, sometimes it's just later on, after we've left the situation. Later on, when we're doing something else, that we realize we could have said something else. Later on, when we feel that, oh, I could have said this. That would have changed the situation. Could have said something clever. But Jesus is trying to help us say things that are going to bring life and goodness and help us keep our health in all situations. By de-escalating from the anger and the hurt and the pain. Jesus tells us to back up. Don't keep revving the engine when we're being taunted? How can we put it in neutral? How can we slow down and even back up from a dangerous situation that somebody else is maybe luring us into? You know, I was asking Richard here, because he works for the Automotive Museum, I asked him, why is it that cars have 6 gears that go forward, but only one that goes in reverse? There's only one that brings us back from the cliff if we've gotten too close. And Jesus says there's really only one way to back up from a bad situation without making it worse, without going over the edge. And Jesus says, use this tool. It's the only one we got, and it's called being good. It's called letting God's goodness flow through us. Get into the gear of God and back up from that situation, because it may be what saves our life from going too far. Backing up. The enemies in our life may change at different times, because the enemy is more like a spirit that comes and goes in the spirit of people. Most people, most of the time, are nice, but in some circumstances, with varieties of reasons, they get hurt, they get angry, they get hurtful and dark. But the only way out, the only way back, is through the values, the Christian values that Jesus teaches us. To not continue the harm, but to bring goodness and to bring healing where there had been hurt and harm. For what credit is it to you if you only love those who love you? That's a good thing. Jesus doesn't disparage that, but he's saying there's other lessons in life. Especially if you want to keep on living your life, here are some ways to avoid greater harm. And one of the last lessons here is a strange lesson, but I think it's true. He says, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? But love your enemies, do good, and lend expecting nothing in return. Don't expect a lot from your enemies. And maybe you'll be pleasantly surprised. Don't expect actually anything in return from your enemies. But do expect your God to notice what you've done. Do expect the Spirit in your life to notice and to remember when you said, I'm sorry. Do expect your spirit to recall the times when you were nice, when you had the opportunity to be a jerk, when you had the opportunity to be angry